What is up, jail life? Modell here. Sector shaft brace, Synergy or Steersmarts. I'm going to go over the comparison of the two. I'm going to tell you which one's better. Stay tuned. So let's first talk about the purpose of a sector shaft brace, whether it's Steersmarts or Synergies. It's a two benefit part. One, it reinforces the actual track bar mount on the frame, and it just reinforces it so it's less likely to break away from the frame. The second benefit is the way it works is that it holds on to the sector shaft, which goes into here. And as you're moving the steering wheel, what the JL is notorious for is the steering box actually flexes ever so little. This helps hold it to the frame to prevent deflection. So what that effectively does, because it is holding the gearbox and the sector shaft so tightly to the frame, it prevents and eliminates any deflection and movement that you had in your gearbox, which will translate to a tighter ride inside the Jeep and more responsive steering wheel. Now there are two different products for it. We originally bought the first one for Misty's, and we've been running it ever since. But now Steersmarts has come out with their own, and we are actually taking the Synergy out of Misty's, and we are putting Steersmarts in Misty's. Now let me explain why. So the first major thing I want to talk about is the thickness of the material used. Synergy uses 3/16 inch steel. Steersmarts uses 1/4 inch steel. So thicker material is obviously going to lead to more rigid build, which will obviously lead to less deflection, being a thicker material. So the next thing about the Synergy brace is you can look in here, there's no weld bead. You can tell it's just kind of been cut and bent. On the back side is where those welds are, down the side, none on the inside. Steersmarts has the weld joint all the way on the outside, on both sides. Flip it around, you got all the weld on the inside here, all the weld on the inside there. That's just going to lead to more rigidity. It's just more solid construction. The next thing I want to talk about is the coating that they actually put on the brace material itself. Synergy uses a powder coating, which powder coating is known for chipping. As you can see right there, there's some chipping, rubbing away of the paint or the powder coat. And there's some more. We also had Synergy steering underneath the Jeep, and they powder coated it as well, and we had the same issue with the chipping away of the powder coating. It was a lot more on the steering than it was this, but Steersmarts actually e-coats their brace. So the way e-coating works, the piece is dipped into water with the material on it. It is electrically charged, and the particles fuse to the metal, and it's so much better than powder coating because it gets into all the nooks and crannies. It's actually the way a lot of frames are coated, because if it was this powder coating, and I mean, you would get, especially on the Jeeps, you would actually get a lot of chipping just from all the flexing that you do in the vehicles. So that's a huge difference between the two. So the next thing I want to talk about is actually going to be the sector shaft brace bracket. This one is Synergy's. Problem I had with Synergy's is this bolt came out a lot, and the reason why, well, this is aluminum, and you typically don't use thread lock with aluminum because it can really mess up the thread. So I routinely had to go back and tighten this. I had to seriously tighten it once a week. I know other people have actually lost this bolt. And another thing with this, when this bolt would get loose, the sector shaft brace would start to angle downwards. There you go. Yeah, it would wiggle downwards, which of course is putting unnecessary strain on your parts and can cause your sector shaft to snap. Nice thing about Steersmarts, they have a snap ring in place to prevent that. So that's another one of the downfalls. And of course, the material itself is aluminum, not as strong. I'm not saying aluminum is bad, but just with this, I didn't like it. Being a part that needs to hold the sector shaft to the frame, I honestly want the most robust piece that I can find. Aluminum just doesn't do it. That is one of the advantages to aluminum, is that if this does get deformed, The idea is it will bend back. However, if it bends too much, it will snap and it's done. So the thing I want to talk about with Synergies is actually the brass bushing. This brass bushing, the way this is designed, sector shaft nut fits in from the top, and as your steering moves, it rotates inside the bushing. Now the way this is designed to stay lubricated is you grease the greasert. There's a little hole right there that the grease is supposed to push out, and it kind of makes its way around. Now the problem with this design is there's no real way to keep it in. It would run out of the bottom. From what I understand, Synergy has actually corrected this mistake by adding O-rings to the top and bottoms to keep the grease in there. Another problem this model has is that the hole for the grease to push through has a tendency of rotating and not letting grease in. Now, I have heard from both ways that people who have called Synergy has sent this part out to them for free. I have also heard stories where Synergy told them to press the bushing out and press it back in the correct orientation. Yeah, good luck with that. If you got the older bushing, I would at least try to call them and try to get the updated one. But due to the fact that on the Steersmarts you have the maintenance-free bushing, you don't have to deal with that. It's always going to rotate, and one of the flaws of this design is if this dries out and doesn't lubricate well, this can have the tendency to mar your sector shaft. One of the nice things about Steersmarts is that it uses 1/2-inch thick steel for the plate and the bracket itself. Now what I really like is the bearing. It is an encased steel bearing. What that means that it's encased, it doesn't require greasing like this one does. Because it's sealed, it'll last a long time. It's essentially zero maintenance. And of course it's super thick. The likeliness of this bending is low. But of course also with this bearing, zero maintenance, no noise. I remembered this one when I didn't grease it when I first installed it was noisy AF, which requires routine greasing, so less maintenance. And another quick thing to point out with the sector shaft brace itself, again, aluminum, steel. You can just see how much more steel material there is. Now the idea when you use aluminum, the aluminum is lighter and it has the benefit of flexing. You typically have to use more of it to ascertain the same level of strength as steel. That's backwards here. Another thing that I like about the Steersmarts kit over the Synergy kit actually reuses the bolts in your steering box. Steersmarts actually includes new hardware, and the hardware itself is magna coated. Now what that means, magna coating is a process that is done, and Steersmarts also does this to the tie rod ends, that prevents the actual bolts from rusting. Whether you have the aluminum gearbox in your Jeep or the steel gearbox in your Jeep, the hardware is included for both different kits. If you want to see how to install the Steersmarts sector shaft brace, click on the link here. Another thing I want to point out between the two are these two extra holes. As you can see, Synergy has 2 extra bolts that the Steersmarts one does not. Now what this does, this actually bolts into the track bar bracket that drops down. I'm not a big fan of this design for several reasons. One, it's more of a pain in the butt to tighten these down. 2, these bolts and nuts actually limit the options you can have as far as track bars. We had to keep this one out because Missy's track bar did not fit. And 3, well, I guess this kind of goes with the first one. It's easier to install without these. And so somebody actually reached out and asked me the question about why Synergy has extra bolts compared to the Steersmarts one. Well, I didn't want to just talk out of my butt as to why I thought this one has extra bolts and the Steersmarts didn't. So I reached out to Steersmarts and I asked them, and they told me that because their design was so strong and robust, they didn't feel the need to add these extra bolts because they felt the 4 mounting locations and the track bar bolt itself was sufficient in keeping the part in place and accomplishing all the things that it needs to accomplish. You're welcome, Greg. And so to kind of wrap this up, the last big difference between these two is price. Synergy goes for $250. Steersmarts about $260. A $10 difference between the two. But look how much more you get going with the Steersmarts compared to the Synergy. So if you're in the market for a sector shaft brace for your Jeep JL or JT, which one do I recommend? Well, I'm sure it's pretty obvious right now, but I recommend Steersmarts. What to do with the extra piece?